Well, I'd like to thank everyone and particularly Helen for hosting this event. I wanted to talk a little bit about U.S. broadband and internet policy at sort of a 30,000-foot level, and then invite you to ask me questions if you want to drill down deeper, in part because this is a lunchtime seminar, and in part, I'm not sure what issues you're interested in that I might be able to say something arguably intelligent about. First, a bit of a caveat emptor, buyer beware. One of my friends was at the Federal Communications Commission. He was a commissioner, and one day in the Washington Post column, I think it was the style section or the who shot who section or whatever, it said, gee, Professor Bliplop is not in a position to comment intelligently about communications and computer issues because he doesn't even have a television in his home with his 6 children. Well, I have many TVs in my house, but I confess that I don't own a BlackBerry. I had quite a bit of trouble getting over here and finding the building, and were it not for Damien, I probably would have been late for this talk. But nonetheless, I'm going to opine, as academics are inclined to do, about the topic for discussion today. I like to think that I have a modicum of expertise in the area of regulation. I've been studying that from the perspective of an economist for the last 20 or so years, and Helen mentioned that I ran the center at AEI, also prior to that for a decade with AEI and Brookings, where we tried to do cost-benefit analysis to the extent it was feasible on a number of issues. We also offered recommendations in a number of policy areas, including telecom and internet policy. So, for example, we would do consensus documents on issues in the U.S., like what should be done to promote broadband, and I'll talk about some of those elements in the consensus. How should you deal with issues like net neutrality? So that's what I'm going to try to do, and then I'll see if I can get this PowerPoint to work. So when you think about broadband policy, and one of the motivations for this talk today is a paper that Scott Wallsten and I did. Scott used to work with me at the AEI Brookings Joint Center. He's now at the Technology Policy Institute. But we recently responded to a request for comments by our Federal Communications Commission. Let me just stop. I wanted to mention, Helen said questions were fine. I like questions. So if there's stuff you just want to talk about, this is a lunchtime seminar. So notwithstanding the fact that we're webcasting this for 100 million people, let's have some fun. So anyway, we're going to talk about broadband policy. Scott and I did this paper that was sort of catalyzed, or the reason we did it was because the FCC asked for comments on how they might spend a measly $7 billion in the economic stimulus plan, which was part of the general stimulus plan in the United States. And we provided some general guidance, which I'll get to at the end of the talk. So I want to spend a little time characterizing the broadband market in the United States, talking about key policy issues, discussing how a narrow-minded microeconomist might frame these issues, and then at the end make some suggestions for how to proceed, at least with respect to U.S. policy, and then I assume I'll learn a little bit about UK policy. Now, the bottom line for me, when you think about broadband policy, and I think when most of us, and many of you have written about this in the room here, is that there have been unbelievable changes around the world, over the last, say, 2 decades or even more than that. I think back in the days when I was an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, dialing into a machine they called Andrew, where we had kind of an intranet that I don't know, was preceded the internet or was about the same time or whatever. And I think I had like a 300 baud modem. And today, if we have to sort of tap our fingers on the table while we're waiting for somebody's file or movie to come up, we get impatient. So the world has changed, and probably, at least in terms of information, in a rather positive direction. Here are a few factoids to suggest some of those changes within the context of the U.S. We guesstimate that there are about 70 million wired broadband subscribers, and that's roughly an order of magnitude higher than at the turn of the century. We also think there are roughly 50 million folks who can access broadband, and I'm purposely not defining broadband here, but the internet, using things like BlackBerries. As I just stated with my anecdote, speeds have gone up over time. If you try to get a plan in the U.S. for fixed broadband, it'll typically, a lot of people buy it with a package, like with their favorite digital cables and landline telephone attached. But if you're just buying it separately, it'll cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $40 a month, depending on speed and where you're located and things like that. There is a huge discussion, as I'm sure you're well aware, of whether the U.S. is behind or ahead or somewhere in the middle in how broadband is supplied. As an economist, I view that discussion as somewhat irrelevant, not for political reasons. I understand why politicians want to discuss it. But the way economists typically think about this is, are there major market failures that are resulting from either government policy or the structure of the market that need to be addressed? And if there are not such failures, and we can talk about what those things might be, and I will a little bit, then there's probably not an overriding reason for the government to intervene. So if the OECD ratings came out and put the U.S. at the bottom of the pile, and I didn't think there were significant market failures, I wouldn't get particularly excited about that. Or if I didn't think the government would introduce intelligent policies that would remedy those market failures, I might be reluctant to address this issue. So what I'm suggesting is there's nothing particularly special about broadband, notwithstanding the comments of politicians, that should put it into a special box. And I apologize, I know I'm at the Oxford Internet Institute, but what I mean by that is methodologically, we don't need to invent a new economics to deal with broadband, I don't think. I mean, we can use a well-developed literature on the economics of networks. We can talk about demand and supply, and those kinds of tools, I think, serve us very well. A little bit tongue-in-cheek at the bottom of the slide, I use something that the Economist has something called the Big Mac Index to assess whether prices are going up or down in different countries. Well, for broadband, I invented something called the Hotel Broadband Index, which is when I go to Brussels or I go to London or I go to Oxford and I'm staying in a hotel, how does my ability to get broadband and what I pay for broadband compare with that in the United States? And I would say they're not huge differences, but I seem to have a little bit more difficulty getting broadband in places here without paying for it than I do in the US. And that's just tongue-in-cheek. It's purely anecdotal based on my experience. Okay, one point I want to make in this talk, and it's going to be really important as you see broadband and internet policy unfold in the United States over the next year or two, because I think there are going to be some major changes. And I know the Internet Institute looks at some of the politics and underlying sociological factors that are driving things. You can understand at least a non-trivial portion of the kinds of policies we observe by understanding what the well-organized interest groups want in this area. So just building on Mansur Olson's seminal work, The Logic of Collective Actions, why certain groups organize and get things and why others don't in the political process. The ISPs, the Internet Service Providers, all of these groups are, by definition, pursuing their private interest. The ISPs, a very important item in their agenda right now, is to get an adequate return on new investment. If they're going to be building fiber to the home at speeds that are an order of magnitude higher than you can typically get, billions of dollars of investment, they're going to be concerned about their ROI. Content providers ranging from the big folks like YouTube and Google down to small fries like your next door neighbor who has a website, basically want to avoid paying more for hooking up to the web. So if you read the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times and see these discussions about net neutrality and things like that, I think a lot of it can be simply understood in terms of whose ox is being gored. And NGOs have a host of concerns both in Europe and the US. In Europe, I think privacy is much more prominent. So that's a simple political perspective on the issue. All right, where's US internet policy going over the next few years? Well, there's a lot of money in the stimulus bill, and there's a non-trivial amount of money that places like the FCC have to disperse. And their huge problem that they face is how to the first problem that government agencies face in giving out money is simply not to get egg on their face, to do things that are going to raise the ire of politicians or the public by sort of abusing or misusing the funds in some obvious way. And then after that, they kind of worry about the concerns that many of you may have in this room, which is how do you spend that money wisely or at least not do silly things? And my hope in this context, given the speed with which they're going to need to disperse these funds to follow sort of the Keynesian view of the world that we need to prime the pump, and I think there's some validity in that, my hope is that they think about doing no harm, because I'm going to argue based on the anecdotes that I just presented, some data that Scott and I presented in the paper and several other scholars have accumulated, that the market for broadband services in the US is working, we think, fairly well. Not perfectly, but fairly well. So whether the first challenge in US internet policy is just how to spend this money. I think over the course of the next year or so, given that we have a new FCC chairman and a new administration, we may see new principles for net neutrality. These principles may have more teeth, and I use that word in quotation marks, than the prior principles in terms of binding the internet service providers to do things that they may not want to do. We already see in the Congress, some of you may have read about this, they're holding hearings on pricing, how the wireless firms are pricing things like text messages. My own view is that it would be a huge mistake to think about regulating these firms on these issues, and we can talk about why if you want. There's going to be a lot of discussion about how open or closed various networks should be, how much property they should be required to share and on what terms. So this is like a continuation of a discussion we've been having for at least a decade, if not longer. What terms should you be able to access the wireless network or the internet backbone or whatever? Should firms like Skype be able to hook up to my mobile for free? And there'll be large issue discussions around spectrum. We had a big issue with Comcast and BitTorrent and how what users should be allowed to do on the internet network last year that Kevin Martin and that FCC disposed of. I think there'll be more discussion of issues like that. And President Obama has already announced his intention to deal seriously with cybersecurity. It's an area that I hope some of you are working on and I want to learn more about because I think it's important. So my bottom line, my takeaway forecast that you can take to the bank. My mother once called me when I was working at the Council of Economic Advisors and said, well, son, what should I invest in? You know, you're working at the Council of Economic Advisors. She said, Mom, even if I knew, which I don't, I couldn't tell you because I'm part of the government. But anyway, she was a little disappointed that all of my education and their hard-earned dollars spent on my education didn't lead to very much. The U.S. or world market forecast, and one of the reasons I think there may be an opportunity for bad policy as well as good policy in this area, is things are going to get better no matter what. Firms are going to figure out how to do things. The question is how rapidly things get better, how rapidly companies find it in their interest to bring new things to the market, whether it's the iPhone or the BlackBerry or the latest gadgets that you probably have that I don't understand or can't pronounce. So we're clearly moving to a more networked world, both in the U.S. and abroad. Okay, let's just deal with Econ 1 for 2 minutes so you can indulge me. And I will introduce what many view as our standard paradigm for policy analysis. In thinking about, as I said earlier, broadband, we begin by asking the question, is there a market failure? Is there something that a supplier or a provider of one of the inputs to broadband isn't putting in his or her calculus that is leading the overall system in some way to a suboptimal delivery of services? So a classic example you can think of in terms of an externality might be the fact that a given provider may not take account of the fact that the more people who are connected to a network, the better off I might be because I might be able to find that person. And they may not be able to figure out a way to capture enough of the economic gains to put that person on a network. So that might be one form of externality or potential market failure you want to think about. In that case, that's a positive network externality. Interoperability. There was a big discussion about whether the FCC should require portability of phone numbers. And I don't know whether that's required here, but in the U.S. it's required. I think it's probably a good idea. If there's only one network provider, my wife and I have a home up in the country, there's 1.5 network providers for that, depending on how you count satellite, but it's not easy to get. You might want to think about whether regulation is called for. So the first step in the analysis, the way an economist thinks about this, is to identify some kind of market failure. Then you want to think in the context of broadband, what are the policy levers that you can pull to where you might be able to improve the situation? There are a number that we'll talk about. One is to bring more spectrum to the market or allow it to be traded freely. A second we'll talk about is auctions, in this case perhaps reverse auctions. A third is what we call antitrust, what you call competition policy. And a fourth might be direct regulation. thou shalt have provide a certain quality level of services, either for mobile phones or internet services generally. And so after we go through that kind of analysis, begin to evaluate those levers, what those levers might do in the real world, we make recommendations. In doing that, our primary challenge, remember I had that slide on interest groups a few minutes ago, our primary challenge is to separate what might loosely be called, and I'm not claiming that I have any monopoly on defining this, the public interest, from the cacophony of private interest, which we know individual interest groups are going to have. Typically, economists are looking for policies that either are going to directly address inequities that people perceive in the system, like certain people in rural areas might not have access to broadband, or certain low-income individuals might not have access to broadband. We're also looking at ways to promote innovation. And I think there's been a sea change in economic theory toward the work of Joseph Schumpeter over the last 20 years. That is to say, we believe that concerns about dynamic innovation, where you get a new mousetrap, if you will, a really stellar innovation, whether it's a Google search engine or a BlackBerry, or I don't know what your favorite example is, but you're getting the flavor, is much more important than worrying about the last few utiles you might squeeze out of having a perfect pricing policy for the iPhone or something like that in the short term. So economists, I think, believe that dynamic innovation is a lot more important than static innovation, dynamic efficiency is a lot more important than static efficiency. So it's really important to get some of the signals right that give firms appropriate incentives to invest. And if you are concerned about equity, either poor people or rural farmers not having access to a technology, we want to try to figure out, we as economists want to try to figure out how to provide that cost effectively when it might not be in the interests of politicians or other interested parties to do so. So my bottom line, and I don't think this reflects a consensus within the economics community, though I think a lot of economists feel that way about the telecom and IT sector, is you should regulate with a light hand and you should be very respectful of property rights. Okay, so what are the principal concerns that we've heard voiced over time for broadband and internet in the United States? And I'm here focusing on economics because there are a lot of concerns when I go to internet conferences and I hear people tell me things like, information wants to be free. And I scratch my head and I go, what does that mean? So I'm going to give you the concerns from the perspective of a narrowly focused or narrow-minded microeconomist who sort of divides the world into concerns about efficiency, how do we build a better mousetrap or encourage Google or Microsoft or Verizon or Vodafone to build a better mousetrap, or somebody building something in a garage, or dealing with equity concerns that have been identified by different communities. So I think the degree of competition in the broadband market, particularly in some countries, is a legitimate concern. However, if you look at the trend in the United States, and Scott and I lay out a little bit of this data in the paper, you certainly see that the quality of service has risen over time. And if prices, it's hard to get a quality adjusted price, and if you want, we can talk about that. But prices certainly have not skyrocketed in this area. So, and there appears to be more competition over time, where you might measure competition in terms of the number of suppliers in a particular geographical region. we can get more technical if you wish. So the number of providers varies, as I mentioned. We have this Home in the Country. There's basically one provider in DC. I know of 3 or 4. There may be more for the technologically sophisticated. It's just not a big issue. It is true, however, that the uptake rates on broadband do vary by groups. And I think I put this graph in there that it's hard to read, and I apologize for that. But it basically shows that higher income individuals are more likely to have access to broadband in their home than lower income individuals. Now, other people may have access elsewhere. So this is one of, I think, the concerns that was driving the request from the FCC about a broadband policy. My own view about this is rather cold in a way, or cold-hearted. What was that book by Alan Blinder? Was it Cold Minds, Warm Heart? I can't remember. but my own view about this is if you're concerned about folks at the lower income, who don't have very high incomes, poor people, I wouldn't necessarily focus on providing them broadband as my first priority. I might follow Milton Friedman first and not be paternalistic and say, if you care about these folks, just give them a cash voucher. And if they choose to spend it on broadband, great. If they choose to spend it on something else, great, provided it's not socially damaging in some way to society. But nonetheless, there's a real political concern in the U.S., both in telecom policy and more generally in broadband policy, I think related to 2 groups. One is folks who live in rural areas, independent of whether they're rich and poor, and the other is folks who are poor. So I just wanted to present a little data. Let me try to wrap up, and I see you scared off all the questions by getting people worried about whether they had to sign their life away by signing.
Simple.
Right. Well,
Okay.
okay. Let me wrap up with a few recommendations. And there's an old saying about academics, which I think is correct. We don't know very much, but what we do know, we keep repeating. And so many of these recommendations, though not all of them, are recommendations that I think have been broadly embraced by economists over time. Maybe since Adam Smith, Ronald Coase, whatever, depending on the recommendation. So I'm going to walk through a few of these without getting into a lot of detail unless you care to. One I mentioned already, I think I put it up there as the Hippocratic Oath, but I think it's really important in this area where the government's asking that a lot of money be spent quickly, that you think about doing no harm. So if you are of the belief, as I am, that this market is working reasonably well in the United States with a few caveats, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater by saying we're going to fund another government corporation or have special bidding, for a 5th provider of broadband services or whatever. You want to focus kind of surgically on where you think the most important problem is. I think you want to find out where that problem is. Scott has done some good work, and others, on looking at broadband supply. It's also very important, as we argue in the paper, to look at what do people really want here. Do they want reliability? Do they want speed? Do they want 24/7 access as they're going in trains and whatever? Or some combination, and what are the trade-offs? So if you're the government and trying to address a need, make sure that's a real need. And we think it's important to identify what those trade-offs are. One area that I think there is an incredible degree of consensus among economists is spectrum policy. And we ought to be, we can quibble at the margins about whether we ought to set aside a small amount of spectrum to have some kind of commons and things like that. But I think broadly speaking, when you look at the tradability of the property rights underlying spectrum, most economists view that as a good thing that we should have more of, that the government ought to be willing to give up some of its spectrum if its interest was economic efficiency, that we ought to encourage the government to deal creatively with parts of spectrum that aren't being used wisely, like that's being given to the broadcasters now, and that we ought to get it out there. So the FCC has made tremendous strides that have resulted in billions of dollars of welfare gains for consumers, but there's still a lot more out there that can be done. I also think the burden of proof in the area of spectrum should be with respect to those folks who would prefer to encumber it. So for example, I did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation on the 700 megahertz auction, where one of the blocks of spectrum there had what was called an openness or sharing requirement, which essentially meant if company X won the spectrum, they had to make sure that a huge range of devices could be compatible with that spectrum, say if they were offered a huge range of mobile phones or something like that. I don't believe that those kinds of restrictions on spectrum are either a good thing for the government in terms of raising revenues or a good thing necessarily for society. So I think the burden of proof should be placed on those who want that. And indeed, if you actually look at the prices that the C block fetched on a normalized basis versus some of the other blocks in the 700 megahertz spectrum, you do see differences that at least confirm my point about revenues, not necessarily consumer welfare, because we didn't measure that. I think it's important to have a vigilant antitrust policy, particularly if you have one or two providers. But that doesn't mean you should necessarily do a lot of stuff before the fact to impose a lot of requirements before the fact to address these issues. I think antitrust is probably my tool of choice in many cases. One of the things also that Scott and I feel strongly about with respect to this particular issue is something that's near and dear to academics because it keeps us employed, but also because it has the potential to keep the government honest. So if our point is that if you're going to give away a non-trivial amount of money like $7 billion in a short period of time, you ought to be able to evaluate whether your disbursements of these funds has done anything to, say, increase the number of increase the number of low-income people who gain access to and use broadband, if that was your objective. So we think it's really important to design policy evaluation in from the get-go. I guess the only thing that I didn't cover there was the idea that if we're giving money out, we ought to try to do it in a cost-effective way. And there are certain necessary conditions that need to be met to establish that. One is you need a clear sense of what it is you're trying to do and be able to articulate that. And then if you can do that in a way that's measurable, you might be able to have something like an auction so that the cheapest supplier could offer those services. I'm not saying that they're without their problems, but many economists think they have a lot of potential. So my bottom line is that I think we're going to see more regulation over the first term of the Obama administration. I would even go so far as to say that I think some of that regulation may not be in the interests as economists would define it, of consumers, but that's still an open question. It's certainly going to affect the pattern of innovation and investment we see. And I think for those of us who are interested in regulation, I put myself in that category, it could be yet another golden era for commenting on the efficacy of governmental actions both in the U.S. and abroad. So let me stop there and do what you want to do. Thank you.
Okay. I wasn't, if you don't mind, I don't think I'm just going to talk about the Digital Britain report because I think it's, I don't want to have two parallel presentations, but I'll try to draw in the Digital Britain report briefly, but not go into detail. I mean, I think there's actually there's some similarities and some differences between what the British government is floating now with a report on Digital Britain and the U.S. policy. I think the similarity is they're both expressing a desire for more universal internet/broadband services and using government support to somehow ensure that happens. Mm-hmm. In the case of Digital Britain, there's some remedies that I think are unwise, but anyway, for example, taxing fixed line phones to provide some of that support. They differ in the Digital Britain, and I think to its credit, in a sense, looks at a broader ecology of media. So it's actually looking at the mass media as well as, so it's actually dealing with the license fee and the allocation of that. And I'm not going to go into that because that's a huge issue of whether to top slice the public television license fee to support local news and local and regional news and the commercial stations to do public service broadcasting. And so I'll try to keep in the broadband arena and the internet and not deal with some of the other issues raised by Digital Britain. But I do think it's interesting because the internet is in a broader ecology of media, and many of the most perplexing issues are the interactions across different media, often driven by the success of the internet. I guess first of all, this was a very clear, very reasonable, very useful report about what U.S. policy is and your own perspectives on it. And it's maybe hard to disagree, but I'm going to try. Because it worries me. Your position worries me. I read your paper last night that you submitted to the FCC review, and listening to your review. And I think let me try to express why I think it worries me. I think it might do more harm than good, what you're recommending. First of all, neither of us can say because we don't know what the impact of regulation is downstream. So it's hard to predict the impact of government intervention in advance, but it is taking a risk in terms of the indirect and unanticipated consequences of regulation. But why? Let me try to express why I'm worried. Mm-hmm. We just finished the Oxus survey. The Oxus Internet Survey is part of the World Internet Project, so we collaborate with people in the U.S. and U.K. and over a dozen other countries. And in all of these countries, very, very similar findings with the U.S. in terms of the diffusion of the Internet. As you say, the marketplace seems to be working very well in terms of the diffusion of the Internet up to a point. Mm-hmm. It's come from being a fad in 2000 to being very important innovation to now being essential. We were at an Oxus launch and Dorothy Zenberg spoke about Obama not being able to part with his BlackBerry. Mm-hmm. So it has become essential to him, but the idea is it's becoming more essential to more people. About 30% of UK internet users say it's almost becoming an essential aspect of their day-to-day lives. businesses. It's hard to link the internet to productivity, but it's hard to even have a business if you're not online and so forth. So it's becoming an essential infrastructure of day-to-day life and work. And as it's become essential, it's also begun to worry some of the main players that have never been, well, have looked at the internet as a sideshow, and that the newspapers always viewing the internet in a defensive way as something that will never really affect their business. Now they see the internet as undermining their business model based on advertising and advertising, the dollars being an essential aspect of that. But mass media as well, seeing concerns in the music industry, but also in film and television, their business models being disrupted to a degree, and maybe in the future to a greater degree by the internet and broadband. And certainly the telephone companies, the telecommunications companies, seeing internet ride on the back of the telephone companies and virtually free, and in a way feeling that they're subsidizing broadband. And so it raises very serious business questions, the existing business models of the telephone companies, newspapers, media, even the post office, etc. And therefore all of these actors are now thinking about getting involved in the internet in major ways. The telephone companies are clearly positioning themselves in Europe and the US to have a greater role centrally in broadband provision and internet provision, and likewise most of the other industries. And government is viewing this as now central. And so the idea of, well, first of all, positioning this as, and therefore I think it's essentially bringing in regulation to it. But as you said, essentially it's doing very well. Almost everyone who wants the internet has it in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere. You dismiss the fact that, or try to argue that it's not understood why some people are just not interested in the internet.
My parents are a good example.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But that's a way of saying that most people who want the internet have it. And income is related to internet access. So is education and occupation. There's a socioeconomic divide. But even greater than the socioeconomic divide is what we call a divide in digital choice, where age is a huge factor in terms of older people not being interested in using the internet. And some structurally related choice, so lower income people may not see always as much value in the internet as others. So there's some structurally shaped choices being made that could be made differently. But by and large, changing people's beliefs and attitudes about the internet is not about building new infrastructure or investing $7 billion stimulus. It's about marketing or trying to get people to experience the internet and so forth. So to say, well, and you say you even admit most people who have the internet want it, but not everyone has everything they want, or I can't remember how you put that. Anyway, that there are some wrinkles in this, but then the thrust of your paper is to therefore support government intervention, basically. Even though you talk about light touch intervention, you don't specify what specific policy. You say act wisely or don't direct, but these are hardly arguable. But being unspecified, your paper and your recommendations come off basically as legitimizing government intervention in a market that's working pretty well, which may throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the openness and the governments trying to keep their fingers out of the development of the internet may well have been responsible for the success of the internet to date. So couldn't we talk not about intervening in broadband policy, but subsidizing telecommunication companies. That's what it's about. If you want to subsidize telecommunication companies because they're having revenue problems, that's fine. I think there is a market failure in the U.S. in supporting competition. There's not enough competition in local access to broadband as compared with the UK, for example. I would say any user of broadband in the UK would have a choice of 3 to 4 broadband providers at the local level. So they do have wholesale provision of broadband, but then competition at the local level. In the US, you're often restricted to either cable or telephone provision, and it's not as competitive. And I think that's the force behind network neutrality. So anyway, these pushes in the U.S. That's behind the push for network neutrality legislation. But even the supporters of the internet, those who support network neutrality, are basically trying to push government intervention in this market. Obama, I think, is supportive of broadband, and the internet, but he's supporting government intervention. And I think the whole thrust for government intervention in an area that's working mostly extremely well is going to undermine, do more harm than good. It has the real potential. So that's what worries me. Can you assuage my fears?
Well, I obviously wrote the wrong paper because, my top line message would have been, I get, first of all, this is a response to the FCC, but I agree with you. I don't think that I want to see government meddling, whether it's cross-subsidies, subsidies, or whatever, in a market that's working reasonably well. And that's kind of why I said, I don't know, here it is. So our first recommendation is essentially the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. But it's saying if you want to spend, so I may need to recast the paper and think about this carefully because this is important. This is a top level issue and I've really blown it. But, we really, I think Scott, and speaking for Scott, who I know quite well and myself, we really believe that it's important that you do no harm here. At the same time, we think it depends what you mean by what the government should be doing. They are spending $7 billion, whether we like it or not. So they were just asking for some guidance on that. And we're saying if you're going to spend it, don't muck up the good parts of the market that already exist. So I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I'm not sure I have anything more to say. I feel strongly about the spectrum stuff. I suspect you would agree with me that you could bring more. I don't know about UK, but in the U.S. you could bring a lot more spectrum to market that would do a lot of good things.
There is the UK also has a very the Ofcom has a very liberal spectrum. The idea of market competition for spectrum. But they're actually, in this case, the sort of ideology of competition for markets for spectrum has undermined local television and local news. We're going through a transition from analog to digital television, and like you are, and a lot of local television stations that are the only local stations are analog stations. So they are sitting there seeing their audiences dwindle, and no one will guarantee them a digital channel. So they have been killed as local businesses because of regulation that is ideologically supportive of a market for spectrum. Anyway, I may have that wrong, but I don't think so. I think it's a pretty firm stance of the regulator. But here, where there could have been sort of some guarantees if they want to promote local and regional news, that there would be that those who have a channel in the analog world would continue to have a channel in the digital world, would seem reasonable to me. Would cost no more money. Would maybe a little less raised in an auction, for example. But so I think these all principles come to the details of how they're. So the exact details of government intervention in this area, I think, And then what about okay, I guess a very good question is if we subsidize low-income households and geographic areas that are not provided for, that could be done much less. It costs much less than what the UK and the US are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are we wasting money? And even if we do, if we want to do what you wish, and even if we have money, if it's really a question of uninterest and lack of beliefs and attitudes that you know, I mean, literally, it's our view that unless you sit one-on-one dealing with the people who are the refuseniks about getting online, and also having a step jump in the kind of computer-human interface design, something like Mosaic back in earlier periods, which would enable much more ease of use for older people and others, that there's not going to really be much progress despite lowering costs, which are really quite low already.
I mean, actually, there's very little money put aside in Digital Britain for helping low-income households. 300 million, I think, which is peanuts. And I was just going to ask your point about, yes, people would rather spend the money on something else, and you don't need a new economics. We did a bit of work recently on developing a methodology for sort of costing digital exclusion. So purely on an economic basis, we tried to work out the costs of people not having access. And then we worked out what it might cost to put them online, which would be more than 300 million. And I'm talking about sort of particularly socially excluded groups. At least we did a cluster analysis to sort of identify the groups where there would be the most gains from them being online, economic gains. And there's a certain amount of evidence to suggest that, you know, exclusion effects can be kind of reinforcing. That is, that the people who would gain most, and again economically, from having access to the internet are most likely to spend it on something else and not and not use it. And that is where perhaps the most gains to be made. I mean, for example, people with chronic illness are actually much less likely to use the internet to look for health information than any other group, which has a sort of reinforcement effect. I mean, obviously we were commissioned by a government body to develop the methodology rather than actually carry it out. So I mean, we did come up with a figure of 1.5 billion, which would be the benefit, the actual benefit of getting 75% take-up among the sort of excluded groups. You could question the methodology, but could there not be an argument, an economic argument, for actually interfering in that sense and spending the money on getting those people?
It have to be a behavioral economic argument, you know, because otherwise you have the $20 bill on the sidewalk problem. So unless you're saying the $20 bill on the sidewalk problem is it must be counterfeit or someone would have picked it up already. So why isn't the person who's earning £10,000 a year not already connected if it's not in her interest to be connected?
Yeah, but I'm talking about economic benefits. Well, we did it in three ways. We said benefit to citizens, but also benefits to the economy and benefits to government. Yeah, not all the benefits are to individual citizens. Some of them are.
So your argument is person X who's...
That it could be worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, not that you haven't suggested it. I mean, you've said, I don't know, do things... you had
I'd like to look at your study and talk with you about it afterwards, but I mean, and just think about...
But it's just the question of whether there would be a case for doing that.
We do know that when government has intervened in markets in the past, it's possible for government to provide a subsidy, say for ethanol or something like that, that ends up doing more harm than good. So it's not always the case just because you don't even count the value of the taxpayer money. that you necessarily end up with a better result.
I just wanted to see if I could shift the debate a tiny little bit, because I was sort of taken by the figure that you showed that's also on page 15, which is the share of households with broadband by income, and we see this sort of expected, graph that shows that people who are richer have more access to broadband. And I just started to think about whether or not you would have seen the same graph at a similar point in the evolution of the telephone.
You do. I mean, it's a classic, it's a great question. I mean, you see this diffusion graph all the time.
Yeah, and so the other
So
thing
what's
that I
the
thought was
problem?
interesting about the telephone is that what did you get after this the point that this graph represented in the history of the telephone? You got universal access
You
policies.
do. I mean,
And the universal access policies changed the way that the graph looked quite substantially because they flattened out the graph.
right.
And so I was thinking about, we're talking about really high-level issues of regulation and how you should regulate, but I also wanted to know if sort of either of you could comment on lessons from the past in terms of things like, universal access programs for telephone connectivity that stipulated not that we should subsidize the telephone industry, although that did happen in some places. I'm from Canada, so we essentially got a monopoly on telephone services, but just simply stipulated that this is something of universal benefit. It allows people to communicate with each other. This is a broad public good, and so therefore we're going to try and flatten this graph out. So
Well, this
it's
is,
kind of an open question.
I mean, your question really gets me motivated to respond at a broad level. I mean, there's a natural propensity of politicians, when a brand new gadget comes out, they say, oh my gosh, only a particular constituency is getting access to this, whether it's the rich people on Park Avenue in New York or Beverly Hills, and don't we want to share these gains more broadly by regulating that firm X supplies it at some subsidized price to a much broader community? So I mean, you can, your thought experiment was a good one, but imagine when the PC came out, if we required Dell or IBM or whoever was producing the PC, essentially to cross-subsidize all these individuals, would we see this fantastic innovation that we do in the PC market with whatever we have, notebooks and netbooks and laptops and whatever? So I think, your point is very well taken. You want to look at a snapshot in time with a grain of salt and ask, essentially the point you were making, that there's been this incredible diffusion of these kinds of technologies over time, and we want to take that into account.
Could I just add a little slight an example from Britain today? Fixed line telephones, universal policy service. Of course, you know that fixed line telephone is declining as a percentage of households. And what have we done for the broadband stimulus package? What would be to tax fixed line phones, raise the cost of fixed line phones. Well, who's giving up fixed line phones? Mainly kids and younger people and younger homes. But so seniors who don't use the internet are going to be financing with higher costs of their telecommunications for the broadband. I mean, so that's an example of how government intervention can have real costs, raise the cost of communication, telephony, even modestly at the moment, but higher probably in the future. And if it raises the cost of communication, it undermines economic development generally. I mean, the best thing you can do is try to do things that actually keep the price of telecommunications and internet policy down as high. So there's an example of government intervention, and Wolf tell me that we will propose a tax to support broadband and not intervene. This, if once government taxes something to support that, they will have to intervene, and they will have to know how that money's spent, if it's spent correctly according to their dictates, et cetera. So this is a formula for real government intervention by in offering huge subsidies.
I really welcome the broad thrust of the paper and the objective of thinking through how it might be possible to do no harm. I'm slightly uncomfortable with trading in very broad kind of statements like the internet somehow being the product of a lack of government intervention, and that's somehow necessarily being a good thing. You know, we can unpack that and see who developed the technology behind the internet and who built the networks it sits on, and maybe come to a different conclusion. But I want to just go back a bit and think about, in terms of the overall framework you set out for intervention, just clarifying a few steps in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, the first step, which is there a market failure?
Right.
And maybe specifying a little bit about where there might be a market failure, because it seems that in terms of externalities, network externalities, and potentially also in terms of certain parts of the network, maybe local access where there may be monopolies or near monopolies, and in a number of other areas you may be pointing to market failures, but there wasn't a point where you summarised where you thought there were market failures. And the second part of the question is really, I mean, in your opening comments, there was a kind of throwaway comment when you said, you know, one of the things you were doing was cost-benefit analysis insofar as it's feasible. And my second part of my question is really, how much can economic analysis do in terms of market failure analysis and cost-benefit analysis, given the things that are very difficult to measure, given problems of incommensurability, and given the fact that you're predicting effects and you're predicting utilities in a very fast-changing environment?
Wow. I guess, let me try to take that in reverse order to the extent I understood it, and we can just go back and forth here afterwards. How much can cost-benefit analysis do? I guess my response to that is always, compared to what? If you think of cost-benefit analysis as Cass Sunstein and I wrote about it, which is sort of this broad accounting tool where you might list the costs on one side and the benefits on the other as a way to engage yourself or a broader community in structured thinking about a problem. My feeling is it's hard to argue for important problems where billions of dollars are at stake that it's not worth engaging in some kind of exercise like that. Your comment suggests you're asking a slightly different question, is where the rubber meets the road on sort of classical cost-benefit analysis and the problem of incommensurate things, you know, how much can it do? And I guess my answer is, I don't have a good answer. It depends on the problem. So if we were to choose a problem like text messaging, and we had a particular regulatory...
Well, why don't we choose this problem?
Which problem?
Broadband policy.
That's too broad for me.
So is it too broad for cost-benefit analysis?
No, not once you get to the level of text messaging. That's why I wanted to start with text messaging. But if you, let me just finish with text messaging, and then I'll pick lots of different, whatever you want to talk about, I'll pick. But what I wanted to get at was, if we were to look at text messaging and said, what would happen if Congress made a proposal for regulating the small part of the market where politicians are concerned about this, you know, how might that mess up things? I think we could make some qualitative guesses, and in a workably competitive market, argue that this is likely to lead to reductions in consumer welfare and some unintended consequences. I think it gets a lot harder when you deal with issues like whether Verizon might be allowed to charge Google, or vice versa, for content that flows across one of their pipes. Because we don't have models that are widely accepted by economists that are definitive for dealing with problems like that. Like, you have two people who own the pipes. You know, if they're allowed to charge both sides of the market, what happens? Well, it's kind of choose your model, or so I guess that my take on it is, one, compared to what, you don't want to throw it out, but you do want to recognize that it's got lots of limitations. Two, for a certain class of problems, it can say a lot, and for other problems, it can't say very much at all. And so, broadband policy generally, I wouldn't, if I were directing a PhD student, I wouldn't start with that problem. I'd say, what are the specific elements you're considering for which we could come up with concrete estimates of benefits or costs? So I don't want to, that's why I'm reluctant to start there. I'm just
So the
giving you
difficult stuff gets left out.
not, well, almost by definition, difficult stuff sort of is stuff that's hard to quantify. Stuff that's hard to quantify, by definition, gets left out of stuff that you do quantify.
So
It
you're
doesn't,
measuring the costs and benefits then?
but it doesn't necessarily get left out of the report that you might write to the president or the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. It just says, there's a big part of the puzzle we left out of here, sir or madam, and I want you to be aware that this should not be assumed away. Now, the critics of quantitative BCA, or whatever you want to call it, benefit cost analysis, I think correctly point out that human beings, for whatever reason, have a natural tendency to focus on the number part and dismiss whatever warning label you put on the other stuff, to say, oh, but we left out a really important part of the equation. So in some ways I'm sympathetic to that view, but I'm also hard-pressed to find another alternative for dealing with difficult public policy issues where I want to give a decision maker some sense of what he or she is deciding about.
Mm-hmm. And the first part was, where's the market failure? Is there a market failure?
Is there a market failure in the broadband market in the US that, okay, I take, my feeling about this stuff is if you look hard enough, you can find market failures all over the place. The question is, are they bigger than a bread box, or so small that I don't need to deal with it? And I think this market's working reasonably well. There are structural reasons, as an IO economist, that you don't expect 400 lemonade stands, competing with each other on the same block in this market.
It might be worth, I don't want to monopolise, but in the UK, we think about this in terms of two generations, in terms of current generation DSL services, where the government has the objective of reaching universality, and there are still not spots where simply the cost of reaching people is too great. And then there is fibre, which is a new infrastructure, and we'll see a similar deployment pattern that we did with previous generations, where the rural areas get left out.
Here's the I don't know.
You can see the market as a whole,
Yeah.
or you can see.
Well, that's how you frame the problem, but I might frame it a little bit differently, and this gets back to this Schumpeterian notion, which I was trying to figure out earlier, which is dynamic innovation. So one mental model is, government looks around the world and says, it's fiber this week, I want to make sure all of my citizens get it. Government looks around the world in 10 years. I'm giving caricature just so we can talk about it. A second might be, government looks around the world in 5 or 10 years and says, oh, it's something else, and now we got to get that something else to our citizens. That begs an extraordinarily important Schumpeterian question. Where did that something else come from, and why isn't it in the UK or wherever first? So all I'm saying is we need to think about the returns to those innovators who are going to provide that network, even if their first inclination on the basis of profit maximization wouldn't be to provide it to everybody. In other words, I wouldn't want to socialize that decision because I'm concerned about getting that technology out, not necessarily to everybody right away, apropos of your comment about the telephone and the income diagram, but I want to make sure folks have incentive to build those networks early on if they're big drivers of productivity.
Okay, it's a
So
question-
I'm not
it's a
sure we're
question about-
disagreeing, but I'm just saying.
But it's a question about incentives to the innovators against the political and social problem of a technology or a communication tool becoming more essential to people and providing these 1.5 billion of benefits to a specific target group.
Loose, I'll, with a few quibbles, that's fine.
More questions? Oh,
No, you, because I
It's not so much a question really, well perhaps initially a comment and then perhaps a question. The comment was around the discussion around finding out where the problem is and digital related to digital inclusion or exclusion. And in your paper you say you recommend that there is more work done around looking at broadband demand and trade-offs. And I think that in looking at that comment and what I know about the UK and Ofcom's work in looking at broadband demand, there has been an awful lot of improvement over recent years in terms of looking at differences in demand and relating that, being able to use that to look at issues around digital inclusion. And so I don't know whether, Helen, you would feel that that's true or not, whether there is. My belief is there's quite a lot of useful data in the UK nowadays in terms of broadband demand across different groups, and whether that actually facilitated the work that you've done around the cluster analysis, for example.
well, up to a point.
Perhaps there's never enough.
Well, yes. What I think there isn't so much work on is the sort of actually working out the economic benefits and costs of these things.
Yes.
And I don't know the extent to which this is the same in the US, but in the UK, government is particularly bad at doing that, at working out how much things cost, like the cost of dealing with elderly people, for example. And therefore, it's very bad at working out the benefits of digital things, because if they don't know how much it costs to deal with people offline or to do lots of things offline, they can't possibly know what the benefits of doing it online. And that's why figures like this 300 million in this report, which is, I work out 50 quid a head for people who don't have internet access, is plucked from nowhere, which is why it's come up with £50, which would be useless. And I think that's the problem, because
money left over from the money the BBC had to deal with switchover, to assist vulnerable people with switchover. That's where the money comes from.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's not a good way of working it out. And I think that would be the most important area, because I think in some cases, you know, in some areas, it's a question of segmentation. I mean, if you do the segmentation and work out, you know, for specific groups the costs and benefits, then there might be real things you could do. But I mean, I don't know if you would see that, or you would see that as what that would do to the market. I mean, in this country, we give everybody over 60 a free bus pass. I heard two people.
I'll be for that in a few years.
Okay, I heard two people talking about it on the bus when I came in today, and one of them, they didn't know each other, but they just started talking about the bus pass, and one of them said, you know, it's good. You know, when you get the bus pass, it's good, isn't it? And the other woman said, well, I suppose they'll take it away from us soon.
That's a great one.
The other one said, well, they might make it half price. It was very unclear. It was very unclear who they were.
Yeah, right.
We know.
And where the kind of, you know, predictions about what they were going to do were coming from. There is no plan to get rid of free bus passes, or maybe there is. But I mean, I was going to ask you, surely the free bus pass is not doing any harm to the bus market, is it? Is it?
Bus market's heavily subsidized.
Let's stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
You can't talk to Americans about buses.
no, I use the buses here. But how can you when you say surely it's not doing any harm?
Well,
I mean the
well,
first.
I'm just saying, if we had a free internet pass for everybody, I mean, I reckon you could do a cost-benefit analysis of that for government. If you took in all the benefits the government would get in terms of, I mean, if you worked out things like how much it costs to interact with older people with respect to some of the benefits
Right.
that older people can get, like attendance allowance
Right.
or something.
Yeah.
You took all those costs and you actually paid for, you know, help with using it and everything, and a recycled PC and whatever.
So for,
You know,
I guess, Maria.
Would that hurt? Would that hurt the market? Is what I'm trying to ask.
Okay. Let's go back to Milton Friedman 101.
Okay.
Ton Stoffel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So if I am, if the true marginal cost of that bus ride was always zero because there's no congestion and you're not imposing any wear and tear on the system, blah, 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 then I'm not worried about giving out all these bus passes. But there
Well,
is
no,
a...
but it's not, that's not the case.
Okay, but if there's a real cost to doing this in terms of social resources, then I want to ask the Professor Margette's question, you know, Econ 201, which is, are there commensurate social benefits that make this subsidy worthwhile? That's all. And I have no clue in terms of the buses, but my guess is not. And I have no clue in terms of, you know, the internet stuff, and my guess is I have no opinion.
I was just asking both of you the extent to which you would count as sort of interfering, as it were, because it is interfering. Isn't
But
it?
I don't know how much good it would do, because I think if you define cost in terms of conventional, what people believe cost would be, not as an economist would define cost, but as, if you ask people why they do not use the internet, cost is not a big, it does not loom large.
Right.
No,
It's
yes,
all
but I'm
sorts of
not-
other reasons,
Well-
not because it's too expensive.
Yes,
So
but I
you
mean,
could, a very fractional impact on
Mhm.
use, I think.
yeah, I'm talking a bit more than just paying for the access. I'm talking about paying things, you know, with many people it's a skills thing.
But then
And-
that's an incentive for government, right? Or, well, sorry, but,
Yeah, I mean, it would be providing all of that, making it even more interventionist, I suppose. But I mean, yeah, of course people don't say the cost of broadband is what, because
Yeah.
they may be terrified at the idea of using a computer, or they don't know what it is, like my 83-year-old uncle. He says rather plaintively whenever I mention my work, you know, don't really know what the internet is. I
no,
mean,
you have
know,
to sit down with people and show them.
Yeah, of
it's an
course.
experience
He's not going to
technology,
say
yeah.
it's not cost. That
But, you know, there's just
Gonna
some
say
people
that.
who don't need it. I mean, you know, my father's 80-something, and I mean, I taught him how to use this. I mean, I taught him how to use a Mac, I don't know, 20 years ago, and he uses it to send emails and keep his Christmas cards on once in a while, but I mean...
But that utility is not a fixed thing. And I mean, the Digital Britain report, which is a very interesting document,
Right.
is proposing something which I think is extremely controversial, which Helen's alluding to, which is the switchover of public services, which is the idea that somehow you can reduce the availability of certain services face-to-face or over the phone,
Right.
thereby saving money, as long as you make these available online. And doing that, the government is actually in a position to affect that utility. So for your uncle and your father, they will need the internet.
Because,
In order to
But,
access
that's true, but that's no different. You know, getting back to my point about we don't need a new economics about this, though there may be some behavioral economics implicit in your statement. You know, regulations create winners and losers. Okay, so what you're telling me is that the government says if you know, all firms or government services are online tomorrow, like it or leave it, my father's probably going to be worse off because he can't walk in and talk to a person face to face. And then we need to think about whether we want to address that because we're concerned about equity.
Well, yeah, but we would have to address it, and the US government has thought about that
We
for
have
a long time. I mean, the Internal Revenue Service, you know, discussed compulsory electronic filing for
Right.
individuals back
Right.
in the early 90s, late 1980s.
And the
We-
Canadian government just did it. They shut offices and moved services online, and it was accompanied by a massive broadband connectivity policy. So broadband connectivity policy came first, and then there was a switchover of services online. And in fact, every Canadian theoretically has access to broadband somewhere, maybe not at their house, but within a 5-minute walk. you know, or in some sort of geographic area. You know, who knows? Maybe this has been not totally in the public good, but it was a policy decision that was followed through, you know, to the end, basically.
Well, and I mean, obviously, once it gets to everybody doing it, then you get a whole new raft of benefits by being able to close down other channels, and sometimes it's worth it. They did the same in Chile. They made electronic tax filing compulsory for individuals and businesses. They set up a network of internet tax cafes across the country where people could go in and get sort of internet advice and tax advice. They got almost 100% electronic filing. You know, more than any other country that hasn't made it compulsory. I mean, you know, and then the benefits start to look rather different. So
I was just going to ask if in Canada there was a media literacy policy. But
there hasn't been. No. It's a big sort of gap. Although media literacy education is improving because it's now in the school curriculum from the sort of beginning of secondary school. So there's been that has not followed quite as well. So for younger people, and there was also for quite a long time a policy that came with the broadband national broadband strategy, which was a sort of community-based learning policy to fund public broadband access centers that had a sort of strong focus on digital literacy and getting people accustomed to using services online. And so that program has mostly finished, but there are still some parts of it that are running, and the parts that are running are all the digital literacy parts, and they're targeted mostly in urban communities with very low incomes and on First Nations reserves. And the First Nations component is run totally by like the government, they're not really governments, but by the First Nations in question.
does this happen in the US? Because we've noticed this with other things, that you know, things come out of the UK government that completely ignore anything else that they've done or they've commissioned.
Same in academia. I mean, this is the...
Not here, though.
These are people, yeah.
No, but does that happen in the US?
Well, I think I mean, the answer is, of course it happens. It's a little surprising to me that it happens when the same party is in power here.
Yeah.
Well, don't you think this is a return? Well, may I ask it in a different way? Is this a return to the information superhighway, in a way?
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's Gore's vision of, you know, basically
okay.
plowing money into broadband
national information
telecommunications.
infrastructure.
This is, so in a way, it's a continuity
of. I see the same stuff come out again, having read all those national information.
I thought you were asking me
things. I'm just like, did they just copy it all from 1996 and paste it into a new folder?
They put it online.
May I address the
Sure.
throwaway comment of Damien's, because I don't want to let that go. Which is this about that the internet is unregulated, that you don't want to, that it's highly regulated, et cetera, or that it's highly influenced by government. My favorite quote from the Digital Britain report is, it said, "We no longer want government of the internet, no, government on the internet, or on government, but government of the internet, or government of the web." But it's scary anyway. But you're correct. I mean, when I tried to paint a picture of the internet being relatively unregulated, I'd like to clarify what I meant, which is that clearly internet users are highly regulated by issues, you know, laws about fraud and criminal libel, etc. The internet is governed by non-internet policies such as copyright, telecommunications policy, etc. And then there are policies governing the internet such as domain name registration, etc. But so far, media policy, national media policy, has not been applied strictly to the internet. National telecommunications policy has not been slapped on to the internet per se, nor is it driven like a newspaper. It is not. But these different regulatory models of newspaper, broadcasting, telecommunications in national regimes are now being, I think the question, there's an effort to impose both national and regulatory regimes that resemble media or telecommunications. And I worry about that, because I think Clearly in Europe, I think the game is to move towards a national telecommunications regulatory regime imposing more of that on the internet itself. And that would undermine the degree of relative freedom of regulation that the internet has enjoyed. And yes, telephone services became universal, but they were a monopoly which were unable to innovate. And non-regulated computer-based services became the source of innovation and in the U.S. and worldwide, and helped create. So
yeah, I mean, thanks for the clarification.
Okay.
And I feel much more comfortable with that than I do with just a kind of something which isn't useful, which is projecting this debate onto, frankly, outmoded division between interventionist and pro-market positions. I mean, what we've had is a much more subtle attempt to use economic frameworks to argue for smart regulation. What I don't see, in the case of Digital Britain, is exactly how it's applying media and telecommunications regulation to the internet in a way which is new. I can see there are arguments around subsidies, potentially, we don't know exactly what form that'll take. The internet service providers levies as a funding of infrastructure. I don't see that as anything new which is being applied to the internet. If we think what the internet is, whether it's the domain name system or the protocols, I don't see the internet as a technology suffering as a result of these proposals. I think they might suffer as a result of an absence, which is an absence to really of the attempt to really take on net neutrality and specify in terms of maybe service quality which is available to consumers some sort of an aspiration for net neutrality. But the proposals that are there, I don't see applying in a new kind of...
It's not written in the Digital Britain, or is it, I think, in the U.S. policy, but I think that it's the inevitable direction of if you move in, basically accept the thrust of these policy interventions, then I think the next step will be who's going to regulate it.
Well, it would, in the first instance, it's a self-regulatory framework which the ISPs themselves would be responsible for implementing. So giving information to about alleged pirates to rights holders, but in the event that it fails, which it's very likely to, Ofcom has the powers to oblige ISPs to do this.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, and thanks, Bill.